Welcome. We are very happy and honored and excited to have Jonathan Katz here tonight and to give a talk on our exhibition Andy Warhol Now, which actually just, Jonathan, you may not know, we just will open again tomorrow. We were closed for 2 days. It was sort of like a back and forth in Germany, and we will see for how long we open. Yeah, we are very, very happy and thrilled that you will give a talk tonight, because you wrote so many important texts on the topics the show is about. And so we're really happy to have you here. So thank you very much for joining us. And Diana Cisilski and the friends, I would like to thank very much to host this evening and to organize everything. It's always a pleasure to work with the Freunde. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward very much to the talk.
Yes. Herzlichen Dank. Wir haben vorhin besprochen, dass wir die Begrüßung für die deutschen Zuschauer auf Deutsch machen. Ich weiß, dass Professor Katz auch ein wenig Deutsch versteht. Vielen Dank dafür. Ja, ich begrüße Sie heute zum heutigen Kunstbewusst-Vortrag mit Professor Jonathan Katz hier bei Zoom und on YouTube in unserem Kunstfreunde-Salon. Dass Andy Warhol schwul war und schwule Kunst machte, ist keine Neuigkeit. Dass aber nicht nur seine Themenauswahl, sondern auch seine Methodik durch seine Sexualität beeinflusst wurde, soll Gegenstand des heutigen Kunstbewusst-Vortrages von Professor Jonathan Katz sein. Jonathan David Katz ist Kunsthistoriker, Kurator und queerer Aktivist. Als Professor und Interim Director an der University of Pennsylvania lehrt er Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies und Practice in the History of Art. Die von ihm mitkuratierte Ausstellung Hide-Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture darf mit über 500 Exponaten als eine der ersten großen queeren Kunstausstellungen in einem US-amerikanischen Museum gelten. Heute wird uns Professor Katz unter dem Titel Andy Warhol on How to Turn Queerness into Coca Cola die queere Lesart eines lange Zeit nur in stark zensierter Fassung vorliegenden legendären Interview, welches der Kunstkritiker und Kurator Gene Swenson im Jahr 1963 mit Warhol führte, erläutern. Auf seine sich daraus ergebende neue Lesart so manches berühmten Werkes von Andy Warhol dürfen wir an dieser Stelle schon gespannt sein. Ja, ich begrüße auch recht herzlich Professor Jonathan David Katz und übergebe jetzt an Sie und ja, wünsche uns allen viel Spaß mit dem Vortrag und darf noch eine Sache ergänzen, und zwar alle Teilnehmer hier in Zoom haben die Möglichkeit, nach dem Vortrag ihr Mikro und auch ihr Video anzuschalten und Fragen zu stellen, zu diskutieren mit Jonathan Katz und natürlich auch mit den Kuratoren Dr. Givio und Dr. Diederich. Und alle, die uns auf YouTube folgen, haben auch die Möglichkeit, die Chatfunktion zu nutzen, Fragen reinzuschreiben, und ich lese die dann hier vor. So, vielen Dank. Welcome, Mr. Katz.
Thank you very much. And let's see if we can share the screen and get the images up. There we go. You're seeing it, yes? Good.
Yes.
Yes.
I like censorship. It illuminates the law, the codification of what one is permitted to know or not know, to see or not see, to feel or not feel. For this reason, I count contemporary incidents of censorship, such as the order to remove the David Wojnarowicz film Fire in the Belly from my queer Smithsonian exhibition, Hide-Seek, as a form of paradoxical political progress. For such incidents, finally make visible the weight of the authoritative control we've been seeking to contest in the first place. But there is another kind of censorship that is so successful that it has no name. It too eliminates, expunges, or erases history, but it does so perfectly that there is nothing left to testify to what was once there. Unlike censorship, It's completely transparent, invisible in its contempt. It is thus a mistake to think that queer history has been censored, when the truth is that it's been subject to this latter form. It's been purged, eradicated, redacted in such a way that nothing was ever there. This ubiquitous erasure is by definition an imposed silencing, transformed into an absence. And only rarely, very rarely, does this process reverse itself. But in the case of Warhol, it has. Andy Warhol's interview in What is Pop Art, part of the famous series of artist interviews conducted by Gene Swenson in 1963, and I'm showing you the original publication, is the source of some of the most famous of Warhol quotes of all time. But as a superb doctoral student at the University of Chicago named Jen Sichel has argued in a groundbreaking article in the Oxford Art Journal, we've had a notably skewed relationship to what Warhol actually said. Jen has managed to find and transcribe the original interview with Warhol, which he discovered in the form of scratchy cassette tapes stashed away in a box among Swenson's personal effects, ever since his death from a car accident in the summer of 1969. Jen published the excerpts from the tape in her March 2018 article entitled, "Do You Think Pop Art's Queer? Gene Swenson and Andy Warhol?" And I'm entirely indebted to her transcription of these ostensibly lost tapes. And as I'm about to demonstrate, through the discovery of these tapes, we can literally resuscitate ideas that were deliberately excised from this defining early interview. Here, for example, Warhol says for the very first time, "I think everybody should be a machine, and I think everybody should like everybody." Indispensable utterances that have over the years sustained many critical arguments about Warhol's practice, pop, and indeed postmodernism in general. But the interview was recut by the magazine's editor so that in its published form, every single reference to homosexuality or queerness was ruthlessly edited out. No wonder, as you'll shortly see, Warhol can sound a bit incoherent. The published transcripts actually splice together different conversations into a false whole. With the discovery of the now unedited tapes, we have a perfect instance of the deep connection between Warhol's homosexuality and his aesthetics. Warhol clearly wanted his thoughts on sexuality to be recorded, but the prejudices of the day left those thoughts on the cutting room floor. When I published a little book on queer Warhol all the way back in 1993, I speculated on the valence of his queerness to his art. But with the discovery of the original interview, we now have what even the most traditional art historians must acknowledge as evidence, spoken, moreover, in Warhol's own voice. That voice is hard to understand at first. So as I play you one of the sections in the interview, my slide will quote the words to make it easier to follow. And those words will be pulled from Jen's transcriptions in her article. We pick them up at the beginning, and as you'll see, the tape literally opens with the direct question, "What do you say about homosexuals?" But immediately, Swenson and Warhol's friend and assistant, Gerard Malanga, reframed that question into the arch-ironic terms of then contemporary, gay speech, turning it into a campy critique of the masculinist, abstract expressionist art world. Listen as he turns the painter Norman Bloom into Norma, Michael Goldberg into Michelle, and the dealer Ivan Karp into Eva, all notably macho working class guys. As you'll see, at first, Warhol happily plays along. But I want to call your attention to that rare non-affirmation in Warhol's speech, a brief "no, I'm." It's the beginning of an objection, a profound objection, to the familiar way they're playing with sexuality, and he will, as you'll soon see, revisit and amplify this extremely rare negation into something that becomes the fulcrum of this entire talk.
Now we have to start talking again. What do you say about homosexuals? Oh, you have to ask me a leading question. You know a lot of closet queens who are homosexuals, who are expressionists. Yes. Who are they? Who are these girls? No, Michelle Goldberg. Really? Oh, fantastic. Who else? Al Leslie. Norma Bloom. Norma Bloom. Who's Norma Bloom? Iron Kite. Eva Cobb. Eva Cobb. Oh. How about no. Hey, Eva Cobb. I'm the content. Yeah.
Okay. Jen's discovery of the unedited interview reveals that in 1973, questions of sexuality were hardly incidental to the discourse on pop, but front and center, and deliberately so, since, as Warhol says, I think the whole interview on me should just be on homosexuality, end quote. Swenson, then a critic, art writer, and curator, just beginning his career in New York's art world, had reason to believe that his line of inquiry around sexuality would receive a warm reception from Warhol, because that same year, as you see here, Warhol completed a series of erotically tinged drawings of the critic. These are all portraits of Swenson. And they concentrate on his sensuous lips and tongue. But what makes this recovery of a silenced history itself so queer is that in contrast to the expunged archival record, Warhol's actual work, his paintings, his publications, performances, his entire persona, worked overtime to make visible his queerness. And yet somehow this extensive queer visual archive, with the notable exceptions of his films, has largely escaped inscription as queer, until the discovery of this tape rewrote the equation, as if somehow the pictorial evidence before our eyes was somehow inconclusive. Though I'm certainly also addressing the lost tapes, I do so in fear of what this elevation of the word, of the discursive, implies about art historians' belief in our own methods and our own objects of inquiry. Warhol's early softcore images of young men, mostly his lovers or would-be lovers, are almost never shown today. This is especially the case with his more hardcore imagery from an enormous, from an enormous series of cock drawings ostensibly completed for a proposed cock book. At the Tanager Gallery in 1956, 63 years ago, Warhol even proposed an exhibition of boys kissing using that very title. It was a remarkably bold political move in the mid-50s, and Warhol was surely not surprised when the exhibition was rejected, not least because the gallery boasted the macho Dutch-American abstract expressionist Willem de Kooning on its board of directors. But that Warhol proposed such an exhibition, at once defiant, politicized, and boldly dissident, amidst an era when homosexuality was quite literally illegal, is telling. Not least because he was doing this over a decade before any national queer civil rights movement was born in the United States. This consistent inattention to the homoeroticism of the early work, not, mind you, to his persona, which remains notably queer, has offered what is at best a skewed picture of Warhol to the public. But the roots of what Warhol became can be traced to this moment, as is beautifully exemplified in this 1956 drawing, which would in turn be recycled into this, the 1969 famous cover Warhol designed for the Rolling Stones' Sticky Fingers album, itself released in '71. Hardly marginal, this was the album that rocketed the Stones from popular to legendary. Unlike today's homophobic elisions, uncomfortable silences, and studied omissions, at the time his art was new, Warhol's sexuality was generally the very first thing anybody said about him, anything anyone said about him, and often the first thing he said about himself. In a 1962 radio interview, accompanied by his friend, the Met curator Henry Geldshaler, Pop Warhol responded seemingly at random with yes or no to non-yes or no questions. Geldshaler helpfully added that, quote, when Mr. Warhol says yes, he means no. And when he says no, he means no, end quote. The exasperated interviewer then thanked Mr. Warhol towards ending the entire fiasco when Andy finally piped up and said in a studied feminine voice, that's Miss Warhol, end quote. When his art was new, Warhol's queerness was not only mentioned, it was thematized, which is to say credited with determining the course and direction of his work, made over into his defining motive and purpose. In some real sense, we have gone, in fact, backwards, socially and politically, since the early 1960s to muzzle what was once so articulate. So let me say it as succinctly as I can. In the early 1960s, Warhol's art was made queer through and through by him and by others. How Warhol framed his queerness, and in turn how he was framed through it, is my theme today. A case study in how the market influences the writing of art history, and not, as we would like to believe, the other way around. In so doing, we will find that contrary to expectations, Warhol's queerness was actually more forthrightly acknowledged early in his career than it would be later. And it was done so by him and others. We'd also find that his early success was widely understood by him and by others as directly related to his sexuality. But as Warhol's fame rose along with his prices, his sexuality tended to drop out of the conversation, though not through any fault of his own. Well, not entirely drop out, rather it was transformed into mere biographical fact. An instance of something severed by a wide and deep gulf from the high value commodity that remained his art. As an aspect of simple biography, a threatened positivism, sexuality is given no more purchase on his art than being born in Pittsburgh. That's in part why his early self-evidently gay work is so rarely shown, since its existence obviously begs the question of the role of sexuality in Warhol's art. Yet addressing Warhol's queerness brings to bear important historical differences, for there are no less than 3 distinct modes of queerness visible in Warhol's work. The first 2 we readily recognize. One of these features homoerotic images of young men. This is his 1956 reclining male nude, and it conforms, of course, to cultural expectations of what a gay art should look like. And it was singularly unsuccessful in circulating beyond the relatively small group of gay men who more or less found it enticing. Another model of gayness on offer, not nearly so inward turning and insular, instead addressed itself to dominant culture. Indeed, it manifested its queer bona fides through reference to the non-queer world. I'm showing you here, for example, Marilyn Monroe's lips. This too is a familiar mode of queerness, of gayness, subjecting dominant culture to a judgmental queer eye and a withering tongue, elevating discernment and taste as its weapons. Camp is its primary mode, the recognition that what passes for the natural in our culture is in fact a social construct, a semiotics of the natural, as evidenced in Monroe's lips. This latter model is in many respects the obverse of the earnestness of Warhol's early male nudes. They seemed so deliberate and serious. Now the work is arch and ironic, the very definition, in fact, of camp. And unlike other models, like the earlier one, it's a subcultural formation that not only promotes an engagement with dominant culture, but speaks dominant culture's language, referencing its codes, all the while critiquing and internalizing its standards. I trust I don't need to belabor the point about why a gay kid like Warhol might find a certain pleasure in revealing the ostensibly natural category of gender as instead an artifact of the social. To be marked as unnatural, as Warhol would have been at the time, surely made the natural a logical target. But it's the third model of queerness that I find most elusive in Warhol, largely because it violates the defining norms of gayness as rooted in subcultural identity and notions of difference, that which gives gayness its charge. This last mode is what is finally made plain in the recorded interview, but it has been visible in his art all along, hiding in plain sight. As we'll see, this anti-identitarian vision of queerness wars with the more particularly erotic and camp modes of his art. But we shouldn't be concerned about that. After all, he was exploring the contradictory meanings of queerness over a decade before any of our familiar battle lines were drawn in the aftermath of the Stonewall riots in New York. The very earliest works by Warhol, in his nascent pop style, can be seen as a transition from his previous recognizably gay model of minority erotics, such as the boy drawings, to this other, more dialectically camp and queer mode. Any serious engagement with Warhol's art has to make sense of this pop mode. It's what made him perhaps the most famous artist of the last half of the 20th century. And yet it is a mode that has been noticeably resistant to queer readings. Yet Warhol's earliest pop works all display the hallmarks of camp, which is to say, an emphasis on the construction of the ostensibly natural. Here's his quotation from the back page of a comic book featuring a familiar Warholian homoerotic shirtless male with the truncated tongue-in-cheek inscription, "Strong arms and broads," excavating the latent sex appeal of a well-built male. Of course, originally it said strong arms and broad shoulders. Below it, the partial text humorously reads, "Should hands and fingers," as it approaches his midsection, the whole summarized as anti-New York. The image celebrates the irony that the ostensibly natural category of maleness is, as we see here, laboriously something to be achieved, not merely born, right? With the added irony that a strenuously rebuilt male body is now deemed more natural than one's natural form. In his advertisements from 1960, that camp bodybuilder is joined by a series of other commodified undercuttings of the category of the natural. These include everything from an advertisement for a man's toupee to a nose job to a rupture illustration that is humorously sexless. Wiggs then follows a similar plan composed entirely of artifice parading as the natural, that it was painted as he chose his own hairpiece, as the nose job image in the previous painting coincided with his visit to a dermatologist about his rosacea, is relevant but not self-evident, nor was it intended to be. Rather, in cataloging the construction of the natural, how we actively fashion what we claim naturally to be, Warhol's queerness was instead written in and as a process of selection and citation. But the question of how Warhol's art and why Warhol's art switched from either markers of subculture, as in the male nudes, or camp quotations, to this third mode, a wholesale embrace of popular culture, I'm showing you here 210 Coke bottles, has not been fully explored nor explained. The value of that switch for the artist is self-evident. It's what made Warhol Warhol. But what led up to this changeover and how it was understood at the time is still largely unexplored. And what follows, I'm going to try to illustrate how a turn to the archive can rewrite one of the world's most often exhibited artists, explaining Warhol's abandonment of a manifestly gay art in favor of what would become his much more queer pop mode. That archive is not only his recently recorded interview, but also a careful reading of the social history of his time. In 1958, 4 years before Warhol's very first pop exhibition, the important American critic Harold Rosenberg described and analyzed what he defined as a newly emerging tendency in American art. It was in an introductory essay to an exhibition that he curated, which he called The Audience as Subject. In this important but understudied essay, Rosenberg offers one of the earliest accounts of what today we would easily call postmodernism, an art alive to and able to theorize the fact that it was being looked at by an audience. As Rosenberg wrote, and I'm quoting his essay, instead of concentrating on art, its problems, and its needs, the artist now speaks to the audience about itself. His image lurks on the wall of the gallery as a disguised mirror, unquote. Let me be clear that Warhol was not included in Audience and Subject in 1958. But by the early 1960s, his art was being discussed as exactly such a mirror of the audience. In fact, in his autobiography, Warhol would famously construct not just his art, but even himself as a mirror. And in one of his most famous epigrams, he wrote, quote, "People are always calling me a mirror. And if a mirror looks into a mirror, what is there to see?" End quote. Less than a year later, in 1959, in an article called Death in the Wilderness, Rosenberg had decidedly rethought and nuanced his account of an art that mirrored and integrated the process of its meaning-making. In that article, surface and reflection now reemerge as the defining trope, not just of art, but of all of American life. As he put it in the article, and I'm quoting him, "American life is a billboard. Individual life in the US includes something nameless that takes place in the weeds behind it," end quote. Americans have become, he argues, walking billboards, public advertisements for a way of life carefully composed to be seen, but rarely authentic to innermost thoughts and feelings. To be American, Rosenberg writes, is thus inherently performative. To compose your face, to conform, to echo and reflect dominant social and political ideologies. In this, Rosenberg, like a lot of left intellectuals, clearly had an axe to grind. In an America only newly emerging from the hysterical anti-communism of the 1950s, from its McCarthyite period, from the Red Scare, the combined effect was to enact a superficial, but nonetheless carefully policed performance of conformity. And Rosenberg wasn't wrong in diagnosing this. The same year that he wrote Death in the Wilderness, California law dictated that one had to swear that one was not now nor ever had been a communist in order to secure a fishing license in Oakland, California. In this context, it's hardly surprising that American life was a billboard and nameless things took place in the weeds behind it. My point is that 4 years before Warhol emerged as a pop artist, Rosenberg had already made his bed for him. Death in the Wilderness describes an artist who had not yet come to the fore, but who was going to be powerfully distinct from the abstract expressionists of the previous generation. This new art would not be an expression of the artist's subjectivity. Rather, it would be about the audience and how they saw and understood themselves. He had prophesied the emergence of a new art that made the terms of its mediation, of how to read and interpret it, its central problem. Rosenberg's diagnosis of American life as inherently conformist and superficial, as a disguised mirror of popular culture, is of course a strikingly avant-la-lettre definition of what would become shortly pop art. And even more remarkably, Rosenberg would not only predict this development of pop, he would precociously deploy its defining a term that would come to characterize pop before pop even emerged. That term is camp. As Rosenberg wrote in the same piece, quote, "You cannot fit into American life except as a camp," end quote. A full 5 years before Susan Sontag's vastly more celebrated Notes on Camp, Rosenberg gives this emergence of camp a social and political force, lending it significant explanatory power. As Rosenberg wrote, quote, "A good deal of the notorious conservatism of our present generation is ancestor camping. That is, a deadpan take-off on life with grandpa. In the camp, the masquerade becomes the real thing," end quote. Rosenberg thus countered the horror of conservative Cold War culture through camp. In the country's outward obedience to conservative norms and values at the close of the 50s, he argued that the younger generation was in fact marking their distance from these traditional norms in a performance, as he put it, of life with grandpa. Surely to argue, as Rosenberg does here, that the oppressive conformity of the American Cold War 1950s was but a kind of put on would have come as news to those other Rosenbergs, Ethel and Julius, who fried in this very electric chair for their trumped up treason. But it is, I think, symptomatic of a major shift in intellectual currents that begins here and directly informs the development and reception of both Warhol and pop art in general. As the era's deadly serious politics of anti-communist red baiting began to fade, its worst excesses began to be seen in terms of a playful campiness, as if the only way to explain the horror that was McCarthyism was to remake it as a kind of ironic joke on what it was to be an American, patriotic conformist. This was Americanness denaturalized, desacralized, converted into an echo of itself. Rosenberg's precocious articulation of the centrality of camp's denaturalization to America's self-image even included an astonishingly forceful articulation of camp's own queer genealogy. Unusually for this period, Rosenberg directly points to homosexuals as responsible for the period's camp energy, writing, quote, "Just how much play acting there is in this is indicated by the enthusiastic participation of homosexuals in the reconstructed family movement. Indeed, fairies and near-fairies are in the vanguard of our new domesticity," end quote. Couldn't be clearer. Because Rosenberg understands American life as a billboard designed to hide the real life taking place behind it, he intuits homosexuality in an indicative relationship to American identity at large, thematizing its promotion of a split self, a performatively divided public and private identity, as endemic to American life in general. And furthermore, that split self traffics in camp, in the denaturalization of the ostensibly natural as a means of mobilizing a recognition of its own inauthenticity. There we have it. In 1959, the homosexual now constituted as the model American, precisely because the homosexual is the widely established embodiment of a self-consciously constructed identity geared to public consumption and thus inherently performative. At the end of one of the most homophobic decades in all of American history, a decade in which more queers lost their livelihoods and many lost their lives than any other, the split subjectivity of the camouflaged homosexual had become the very model of American subjectivity at large. No wonder that but a few short years later, starting in 1962, Warhol would begin a series of portraits of famous, similarly split subjects. And the images would show the split, the divide. Jackie Kennedy in the week before and after the president's assassination. In the first part, the very image of smiling charm. In the second, the emblem of a stoic private grief. Or Elizabeth Taylor on the set of Cleopatra, then the most expensive movie ever made, which did much to solidify the feeling that the once delicate ingenue was no longer an innocent. He even began first to paint Marilyn Monroe only the week of her death, which was more or less a suicide, an act that underscored how her gilded life was more cage than stage. In these and in so many other works, Warhol literalizes the notion of a split or bifurcated identity, sometimes as here even using, the split between black and white and color to underscore that divide. These celebrated split subjects make manifest the degree to which the public-private division, rather than a special property of homosexuals, is, as Rosenberg has argued, indicative of all of American life. At once selecting such loaded subjects and then carefully calibrating or balancing his representation so as to avoid imputing any of his own narrative or authorial intent, any requisite or required interpretation, Warhol, of course, flirted with the accusation that he had no feelings, since no legible emotion animates his choices. Worse, there's a sneaking suspicion that his motives were not altogether pure in his representation of human suffering, that a whiff of ironic detachment animated his art. But rather than being put off by the accusation that his work was indifferent or impersonal or mechanical, Warhol instead cultivated the notion that he aspired to be like a machine. Early critics even conflated his homosexuality with the work's mechanical quality as a silkscreen image, implicitly arguing that queers and machines shared a quality of passivity born of the absence of will, and were thus, for all their activity, submissive subjects not in control of their own destiny. For example, in an unpublished 1962 interview, Rudolf Arnheim, the German-born Jewish art historian who fled Hitler and eventually settled in the US, complained about the dominance of women in the American family and how the United States' woman-centered society, his words, made American boys much weaker than their European counterparts. Such a train of thought seems to inevitably lead him to consider the dominance of homosexual artists in the post-abstract expressionist art world, and we pick him up here speculating on the impact of Warhol. I quote, "You can say that an art form that is characterized by the surrender of creativity, where the most characteristic thing is that I take passively from the world in which I live and I copy it passively, that this surrender of the masculine quality of creating things has a quality of weakness, of passivity, of adaptation, which conceivably has something to do with his homosexual element," end quote. Rather than framing Warhol's silkscreens as an active process of selection, Arnheim instead declares it to be a surrender, a passive relationship to the world. He then implicitly connects this passivity in art to his gay sexuality. Let me quote him again. Quote, "If you take the camera as a receptive organ, and if you use the camera as something which is being impregnated by the world almost passively without doing anything about it, because you're taking whatever comes, you have a very passive quality in this use of the receptor instrument. Don't you see?" End quote. This absolutely remarkable collapse of the camera into a receptive organ, into, to be frank, the promiscuously impregnable homosexual anus, characterized Warhol's art at the very outset of his career. So powerful was Warhol's queerness circa 1962 that it superseded the self-evidently anti-biographical, non-self-identical quality of the work at this point. The work that showed a parade of familiar supermarket commodities and advertising, Coke bottles, Campbell soup cans, and ads from the backs of comic strips. But Warhol's campy pop mode coexisted with another variant of pop, a contemporaneous third mode that seemed to carry no such obvious camp inheritance. In a work such as the variously printed supermarket boxes he made in 1963 and 64, Warhol seems to have other issues in mind. They are related, to be sure, such as the ontological status of one kind of commodified representation destined for the supermarket as opposed to another destined for the art world, or the meaning of facsimile when the ostensible original is itself merely a copy, but they do not, in the manner of his Marylands, betray anything that is specifically subculturally gay or campy. In turning to the recorded interview, we can secure a better sense of what Warhol himself understood as the import of the relationship between his queerness and his art, for he says unambiguously, in a statement notable for its time, "I want that on my interview."
I think you could really, I would want that in my interview, you know, that we're talking about, like, you know, the homosexuality. You want it, yeah. But it should be on somebody else's too, just to, yeah. Well, who would be the best? Rosenquist. Rosenquist. Yeah, Jack's on. Yeah, he said, no, he's just, no, I think he's sweet. You think Popeye's queer? I'll ask Rosenquist. Yes. And so listen next Sunday for the Rosenquist. It's the same time. June 9, too. Just to get his reaction. No, Bob, Indiana. Oh, you can't go on. No, Bob, Indiana should have that Christmas. Go dance. Because you go, oh, no, it doesn't exist. He came to my poetry reading.
When they finally get down to business, they first play the relationship between pop and queerness for laughs. Swenson's strikingly frank question, "Do you think pop's queer?" comes off at first like a joke. But very quickly, as the familiar camp tone threatens to color the entire interview, Warhol does something very unusual. He begins to push back. More than that, he valiantly tries to redirect the conversation and is, for him, strikingly insistent on doing so. He deploys a string of negations. You can see them here. No, can't, it should be different. Such constructions are highly unusual in the context of Warhol's usually reflexive affirmation. And what he is contesting, as you're about to discover, is the idea of gayness as the opposite of straightness. In place of this polarity, Warhol articulates a call for universal polymorphous perversity, or what Warhol would rather articulate simply as liking.
Okay, well then let's start. What do you know about homosexuality? And have you ever met a homosexual? Did your tan represent a penis? No, it can't be like that. I understand that New York's homosexual is slightly homosexual. The crust of the middle place. No, it has to be on a different, kind of different. It should be a, it should be a different way than, just sort of like, sort of something different than direct. Yeah. Like, when you were drawing shoes, did you want to draw women's shoes?
Once he can get a word in edgewise amid all the campy banter, Warhol's redirection turns on the obvious fact that not all pop artists are gay. So it's not the artist's sexuality that makes pop queer. It's an attitude. What Warhol is trying to get at here so insistently is a new idea about sexuality. It's contained in his twin ideas of liking and of machines, the two pillars of a whole generation of Warhol criticism. What Warhol is seeking to define is an automatic, reflexive, absolute, which is to say, machine-like process of liking. This is a form of liking that is automatic and unmediated. It refuses received opinion. What Swenson, in his brilliant 1966 essay, The Other Tradition, written for his eponymous exhibition for a museum here in Philadelphia, referred to as evolutionary thinking. Evolutionary thinking is taxonomic. It places everything in a singular place, in an a priori teleological trajectory. Swenson's target in that essay is formalist art history, with its easy judgment of quality rooted in this telos. But I think he gets this idea from Warhol and from Pop, likely, in fact, from this very interview, with its notion of liking as the undoing of all extant categories. Notably here, Warhol is trying out a very different vision of sexuality than the one that animated either his early boy drawings or his campy Pop, so in line with the campy gossip that the friends of Warhol were auditioning all around him. To like both men and women, sexually and in every other way, as he says in the quote you're about to hear, is to dislodge sexuality as a key marker of social difference, and thus, of course, of social discrimination.
Has to be something that I do about that all pop artists on like I'm understanding that if all pop artists are not homosexual, what does it have to do with being? Well, I think everybody should like everybody. You should like both men and men. Yeah. Sexually and that's what pop art's about. It's liking things. And liking things is being like a machine. Well, because you do the same thing every time. You do the same thing over and over again. And it's that, yeah. So that is and you approve them. Yes. That's all I can say.
This decidedly isn't bisexuality, as that remains a marker of identity still associated with sexuality. Rather, what Warhol seems to articulate here is an automated, machine-like process of liking. This necessarily entails the abandonment of any existing model of sexuality, where liking is motivated by identity. Such identity constructs can be understood in Swenson's term as mere evolutionary thinking, a way of pigeonholing us into affinities that we know in advance of any encounter. Resolutely anti-hierarchical, Warhol's sweeping affirmations are a vote in favor of a horizontal, not a vertical social order. And that horizontal sociality turns on the valuing of surface over depth. For deep or felt liking, the obverse of his prescribed automated liking segregates us, while his ideal of machine liking flattens and aggregates. Warhol's pop mode is a visual argument in favor of this widescreen approbation, figuring as it does a range of real-life products, people, and situations, some deeply disturbing, such as the disaster series, some satisfying, but all notably resistant to clear definition and extant evolutionary ontology. Warhol here is looking to promote an unmediated, automatic, in-the-moment encounter that flees the demands of definition, that refutes the classification of both us and that which we're looking at. But at the start of the period when gayness first began to politicize its segregation from dominant culture, the birth of the minority model, I hasten to add, that grew up in a context of overt discrimination, judicial terror, and mandatory hiding as a means of negotiating all the horrors of homophobia, Warhol prescribes not coming out, but the very opposite, an anti-identitarian turn away from subjective depth and classified desires. Yet the self-reifying coming out model of gay identity would, at the end of the decade, become instead the very model that the gay liberation movement seized and subsequently rode to great political success. And its central belief was that the world was divided between LGBT people and straight people in a clear and largely binary opposition. Here, long before gay liberation discourse was a political reality, we see Warhol trying another tack. He is describing, I hope the point by now is obvious, what we mean when we use the word queer today. A marked refusal to consent to the notion that sexual desire constitutes a meaningful field of difference. Rather than enforcing an essentialized paradigm of sexuality, this new model actually draws strength from the empirical fact that pop artists can actually not be gay. Warhol's new idea of sexuality is premised not on gay and lesbian difference, but rather on its concerted and deliberate erasure. And pop art is exhibit A in that argument, evidence that our manifold commonalities supersede and even swamp whatever residual differences we have, differences that, of course, we flatter ourselves into thinking are uniquely our own, despite the fact that they are but the result of our social script. But, and this is key, Warhol's de-essentializing queerness isn't the kind of generalized détournement that passes for queering in so much of the academy today. It keeps its gayness fully intact and articulate. And it is from that stance of gayness that it speaks a queer standpoint epistemology. It's just that that standpoint epistemology is about the emptying out of standpoint epistemologies, in that it has no necessary predicates or correlates, that it betrays no particular cardinal directions beyond one, liking. And Warhol's term for sexuality is liking. In pointed contrast to gay constructs that define sexuality as housed within a person, as an aspect of their innermost core and character, in this model, liking isn't deep, essential, or individual, but automated, like a machine. Because that's what machines do, processing things automatically without will or desire. In this sense, Warhol uses liking less as an affective relation and more to suggest a kind of pervasive analogical account of the real. Conveniently, in its verb form, liking is an affective relation, but in its prepositional form, like is likeness, as in like with like, a recognition of a new kind of analogic reasoning. Admittedly, this is a particularly queer kind of queer liberation, premised as it is on the elimination of sexuality as a form of meaningful difference. A newly concentrated social good to the degree that it eliminates the isolated, hierarchical, painful, or excluded nature of gayness. Warhol suggests, in short, that the proper response to a homophobic world isn't to consecrate your differences, but actually to evaporate them, not by denying your sexuality, but rather by denying sexuality itself as a meaningful aspect of difference. And yet you can see what the editors made of Warhol's frank conversation. The real conversation, the real transcription is the above in white, and what was printed is below that. A pastiche of non-contiguous quotes intended to excise any discussion of sexuality. Though Warhol wanted his thoughts on homosexuality to be preserved, he didn't get his wish. They were instead carefully edited out, not by Swenson, but by the editors. So when Warhol paints 210 Coke bottles in 1962, he is, as he would later write in his autobiography From A to B and Back Again, invoking this new vision of an undifferentiated commonality and community. One premised not on difference, but on sameness, not on isolation, but communion. Warhol wrote regarding Coke, "You can be watching TV and see Coca Cola, and you know that the president drinks Coke, Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and just think you can drink a Coke too. A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is drinking. All the Cokes are the same, and all the Cokes are good. Liz Taylor knows it, the president knows it, the bum knows it, and you know it." To argue that 210 Coke bottles is a queer painting, as I'm now doing, is thus to redistribute the meaning and weight of sexuality from the individual to the collective and communal, so close to our contemporary queer dream. In the Swenson interview, Warhol is trying to put into words this different framing of sexuality, one that is dedicated not to the establishment of its difference from dominant culture, but rather its contiguity with it. In his famous Paean to the Machine, Warhol was searching for a model of social engagement that kept individuality, interiority, identity, even taste at bay, that built bridges across our differences. But despite his manifestation of a reflexive, unmediated liking, Warhol himself continued nonetheless to be framed in terms of his gayness early on. As critic Vivian Gornick wrote in her homophobic screed, Pop Goes Homosexual, It's a Queer Hand Stoking the Campfire, published in the Village Voice in 1966, the most directly stunning result of Camp's influence is, of course, the raucous pop art vogue, which probably has set the course of American art back some 100 years or so. One has the feeling that it all started one day when a bunch of the sweet young things got together after a mad, mad day at the decorators. In sarcastic imitations of the Mrs. Babbitts they serve, the boys began to whoop it up, painting the objects best fitted to describe Mrs. B's crass taste, end quote. So then rather than seeing in Warhol's art a generalized approbation, homophobes were instead branding the entire enterprise as but the mean-spirited revenge of gay shop boys and decorators. Its unabashed bashing, a chilling reminder of how the decks were stacked against an openly gay artist like Warhol in the 1960s. Warhol knew that gay art, as they conceived of it, was a prison from which there was no escape, precisely because it would always remain a minoritized category. Still, Warhol's aggressive erasure of difference in favor of an unmarked vision of sexuality can itself only signify in a context in which gayness is already too visible. Absent that visibility, Warhol's queer dream of an undifferentiated sexuality of liking can work identically to a homophobic erasure of sexual difference. Warhol thus holds onto his gayness even in the context of celebrating its elimination. And he holds on to that gayness not only through his political statements and personal style, but through his continuing investment in a politics of camp. What does it mean when Warhol paints a Campbell's soup can with when Warhol paints a Campbell's soup can with a torn label, he always, and I mean always, divides that label between camp and belle. Camp becomes a seduction, a way to read something against the grain if you're so inclined. Perhaps this is what Rosenberg meant when he said that you couldn't participate in American life except as a camp. Camp acknowledges that we are all acculturated in the same way, while also allowing for resistance within the terms of our domination, a demonstration that control cannot be absolute, that there exists the potential in any mode, no matter how dominant, to be turned against itself. But the only language we have for resisting culture is the same language through which that culture is written. Camp knows and uses this. Camp builds alliances of the like-minded, a liking with a political purpose. As Rosenberg wrote in his prescient 1959 essay, Death in the Wilderness, quote, "To keep a straight face has become an elementary health precaution," end quote. When straight people needed to keep a straight face, it was queer artists like Warhol who could not only show them how, but offer a site of communion, a shared recognition of a deeply ironic approbation of our common culture. That's our challenge as we work to queer our history and culture. It's one thing to show an audience a recognizable gayness, one that resonates with our already existing thinking. It's another thing entirely to queer parasitically, a shifting construct that refutes, decenters, or disallows any coherent vision of what queerness is or should be like. In queering, we need to be attentive to how queerness can and does escape the forms we readily recognize. To both like something and at the same time critique that liking isn't a contradiction in terms. It's an acknowledgement of how we live. As Warhol once said, and I quote him here for the last time, "The more you look at the exact same thing, the more the meaning goes away." That's the very definition of queer liberation. Thank you.
Wow, thanks a lot, Jonathan. It was really an incredible talk. I think everyone's stunned now. But maybe we see more faces who are more, you can switch on the cameras now, if you like. Yep. Thank you again. That was really an incredible, strong and dense talk with so many things. One could start now to have a conversation. Maybe are there already comments or questions from the audience right away? I have to say I don't know the Harold Rosenberg essay from 1959. I do have to get it. Is it widely distributed, or I mean?
Yeah, there's been a collection of his essays that have been published, kind of collected, and that's where I found it. And when I found it, I was sort of amazed that it predicted the development of pop art.
And then being camp before Susan Sontag camps, I mean, that's really incredible.
It's extraordinary, yeah. I apologize. I know this was a lot of stuff, and it may take a while to digest.
It actually was. I mean, maybe I start, and I'm sure there will come questions on the YouTube, and there will be also questions here. Maybe. I have to say I was like really very much intrigued by the 3 categories you made up, because maybe the first 2, they were sort of like more familiar to me, and I guess to most of the audience also. And by the way, they're very well represented also in the exhibition. We have 2 rooms of the early drawings, for example, and they actually also showed one of them, and also I think the camp attitude in the works, especially the film works we showed. But I was most intrigued by the 3rd category. Though I'm not sure if I'm totally understood it, I have to go back to my notes. And I also like the idea you used the word, where was it, the split subject, and of course to my mind came right away the split screen Warhol used. I mean, maybe not the split, but like Chelsea Girls having on 2
absolutely
screens. But mostly for me, a piece also we have in the exhibition, which fits very well to this 3rd category you came up with, is Most Wanted Men. And I think because for me also, and that's something I've actually, it became the most visible for me also then in the exhibition, which is also about the queer Warhol. And so far also a lot of the reading or talking about the Most Wanted Men is, about the scandal, like Philip Johnson invited him, how could he exhibit the criminals so prominently. But we have two images, actually, I mean 4 images, but 2 images where you can see also the attraction Warhol has for these images, because they look, cool guys looking cool. And I think for me, this goes very much in the 3rd category. But maybe if you could, I don't ask you to repeat completely, but how would you summarize, if you would make the 3rd category in, let's say, 6 sentences, how
Sure.
would...
Sure. So, it's really interesting. Let's just take the Most Wanted Men as it's a good example, because the way it's been talked about in the literature is that it actually falls into the 1st or 2nd category, that people think that they were hot guys, and that's what Warhol liked about them. They were most wanted in the sense that he desired them. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I'm saying that that actually is only partially correct, because the other part of this is that they are the most hated, they're the most wanted men, they're criminals, they're the worst of the worst. And here they are as emblems of American life on a gigantic building intended to celebrate Americanness to the world, right? And so what Warhol is looking to do here is to flatten any existing hierarchy. He's wanting to eliminate the idea of taste, of liking, because liking is always a category that's determined by a social script. John Cage put it beautifully. In this is the only instance in which he's Warholian. He said, I never operate in accordance with my own taste. If I do that, how will I learn anything?
Wow.
Right? And so what Warhol wants to do at the very moment that gay and straight are being born as opposed communities, what Warhol wants to do is eliminate hierarchy, to eliminate a vertical vision of society in favor of a horizontal one, to make liking universal and without thought, automated. I like that, right? And in liking everything, he proposes a new vision of sexual possibility for people like him, one that is not premised on saying, I'm gay and I'm going to sue for my civil rights, but rather, right, none of this matters. Our many, many differences are irrelevant. All that matters is, right, that we actually like one another. And that new vision is born before the separatist vision of homophobia and gay liberation. Does that make sense?
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's incredible. Diana Zizilski, do you have questions in this chat?
No. Yeah, there are only comments like thank you, amazing, and wonderful, something like that. So yes, but I can repeat only if there are any questions here in our Zoom audience or in YouTube, you can write if you want your questions into the YouTube chat, or you can put on your video directly here in Zoom and ask your questions to Mr. Katz or also to Yilmaz Cibio, to Stefan Diederich. So that's a really good situation, possibility, good option. Yes.
What maybe I continue. What I liked also so very much on your talk about your talk was that you also talked a lot about the works, and that you, because there would be because the maybe prompt criticism of your talk or of your of your arguments could be that it doesn't matter what the artist says. You know, that's a common thing theorists say. You know, you have to look at the work. But I think you know, and I'm not sure, you know, how to position myself to a comment like this. But to you know, what I liked also about your talk was that all the argumentation Warhol is using, that you appropriate, or that you you know, showed it in direction to the works.
Yeah, I mean, you know, he talks about Coca Cola, right? And that's really what the title was trying to underscore, that in making a painting about Coca Cola, I'm arguing is a kind of queer painting for Warhol, precisely because it's all about the universality of a category, the refusal to break that category into polarities or differences, but to embrace it in its totality. And that's what pop art is for him. That loving of everything.
And you use the word, which I think is a word I liked a lot, sort of like of Warhol's vocabulary. I don't know if I'm correct, communality, which is sort of like between communism, you know, and putting two words together. And I think that also shows how highly political his work is, because I also know voices, you know, who say that he was not an activist, that he was not, you know, for gay rights, and that he did not participate in Stonewall and the liberation movement. But I think in the works speaks you know, in the direction.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a trap for him. Were he to embrace the sort of gay politics that were then available to him, he would be invalidating his own perspective, his own feeling of a kind of horizontal, communal, right, aggregation of just liking everything. He would be saying, I'm this, you're that. And so, of course, he's been misread as not being political. But you don't put the most wanted men on the American pavilion at the World's Fair unless you're political, right? I mean, it's in his actions at every turn.
And you could also say, like, just in to exhibit you know, to want to exhibit and really to actually exhibit his early drawings in the mid and 50s. And you could see the homophobic reaction he
absolutely
then. So that
and to do it in 1956 at the gallery that he knew that de Kooning was the chair of the board, he's deliberately pushing that button.
Right.
Yeah, there is a question, but it's written in German. I think the Zoom members has the possibility to put on the camera, but it seems to not to work for everybody. So there is a question from Michael. It's written in German. I read it first in German and then maybe we can try to translate it together. So, hallo, ich stelle meine Frage auf Deutsch. Ich hoffe, das ist okay für Sie. Warhol sagte, wenn du alles über Andy Warhol wissen willst, betrachte nur meine Oberfläche. Dahinter ist nichts. So Andy Warhol says, if you would like to know everything about Andy Warhol, so see my my superficial, there is nothing behind it. Ja, wie passt diese Aussage zu den vielen verdeckten Codes, die Andy in seinen Werken verwendete? Hatte er schlicht Angst vor Repressionen oder war er sich selber seiner verwendeten Codes häufig nicht bewusst? So how does it work with all these codes which Andy used in his artwork? So was he afraid of repression, yeah, or doesn't know how he used all these codes? Yeah.
So I would say that there are, again, there's sort of three Andy Warhols we have to talk about. There's the early, very traditionally sort of gay male Andy Warhol of the male nudes. There's the camp Warhol of the Marylands, but it's the third Warhol that I'm really trying to push as emblematically queer, not gay, queer. And what I mean by that, right, is that Warhol refuses to allow any definition of sexuality as difference to emerge. And so, in essence, what I think he is saying when he says there's nothing behind this image, there's no interiority, it's akin to his notion of machine-like liking. It's a kind of idea that all there is what people appear to be, and all we can do is like all of that. And that relationship, right, will create the conditions of a social revolution in which minority identities won't have to be tolerated. They'll simply be along with everything else. It's a cognitive switch he wants to make. He wants to end all forms of discrimination. And that includes, importantly, discriminations of taste, right? It's an absolute liking.
Thank you. I hope that's a good answer for you, Michael. I hope so. I think so. Yes. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Gibt es weitere Fragen, auch auf YouTube? Trauen Sie sich gerne, die Fragen zu stellen. Ich glaube, so schnell bekommen wir so eine tolle Möglichkeit nicht mehr. Ja, die Frage scheint zufriedenstellend beantwortet worden zu sein. Okay.
Maybe also if this leads in a different direction, but I think it goes very well in this third category of refuse to allow any definition of sexuality, and also, I mean, in general, refuse to allow a definition of difference in general. And because we also show in our exhibition Ladies and Gentlemen, which actually, I mean, reframe the work. You know, we have a lot of sort of like education and label, and you know, also trying to contextualize that it's also problematic in a way, you know. But I think with your third categorization, it also does not only go for sexuality, and though of course there is also sexuality in play, but it also goes to cultural difference. Yeah.
Absolutely, and what I see Warhol doing, I mean, look, part of this is financial. I mean, Warhol always had his eye on the bottom line, but part of it is also these sort of interesting series that he sets up towards the sort of latter part of his career, where he does Ladies and Gentlemen, where he does Jews of the 20th century, where he does all these categories that bespeak a form of difference. And then when you look inside the category, what you find is that it's sort of identical with everything else. So the Jews of the 20th century have Freud and Marx. I mean, you can't get more mainstream than that, right? And so he's always both giving you the category and then emptying it out of content.
And I think with Ladies and Gentlemen, we actually position it next to Warhol in drag. You know, the film where he gets in drag, and then the photos by Makos, and I think, and also I would argue that the sheer quantity, like he did for Ladies and Gentlemen, for example, and also his own, like, physically almost involvement in these topics and questions, shows that yes, it is a job and it is a commission, but he does much too much for a commission. Makes sense.
Yeah,
there is a certain involvement which goes beyond this.
Yeah. And I think in many respects, even his filmmaking becomes a kind of evidence of this shift. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting is that there was reportedly a big battle on the set of My Hustler when Warhol wanted always to create a kind of clear movement from one figure to another by shutting off the camera and then turning it back on. So there were these sort of abrupt breaks, and he was fighting with Morrissey about whether that was appropriate, because Morrissey wanted establishment shots and all the sort of ways in which one situates everything that you look at. And what Warhol is, I think, trying to do is to eliminate the idea of context. Everything is what is in front of you. Everything is what you're seeing at that moment. It doesn't have to take place in a context. Context is part of the problem.
Thank you. So there's a question in the YouTube chat. It's from Andy Burke. Could you share with us some thoughts about the shown picture in the exhibition in Cologne, where the woman is jumping out of the window? Why is he showing us so brutally how this woman is taking suicide? That's a question.
I guess you know the piece, right? Yeah.
I do know the piece.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe I'll start and then you can jump in. So I think this is characteristic of all the brutality in the disaster series, which is what I'm trying to suggest here is that he has to, if he's serious about the idea of liking as universal, he has to like everything, even things that are horrible, even things that are painful, even things that we don't want to see. And so what the liking series, what the disaster series does is test his own belief in liking. But he wants us to do it no matter what. Because if we start to draw exceptions to liking, if we say, oh, well, we can never like that, then Warhol fears the entire edifice will come crashing down.
It's very interesting, but of course it's also a very slippy ground we entering, because we have on the opposite wall we have a painting where there was also a lot of discussion about. It's Red Race Riot, and we position these two, and I like your description and idea. But likening, yeah, but it would be interesting to to argue if likening is should be also more neutral, like to have it's to be the positive thing of being indifferent.
But then it's not like a machine,
yes.
Right? The machine takes everything that you put into it and sends it out. It doesn't discriminate.
It doesn't judge also.
It doesn't judge.
And that's interesting, yeah.
That's what it is to be a mirror.
So no filter, yeah. That's it. Okay, so are there any other questions in our Zoom discussion or on YouTube? Okay, I see a new person here in the Zoom, Marie Fürstenberg. And there's also a question from Priska Mielke. Maybe first, Priska, bitte.
I'd like to ask why he didn't use the word to accept, but the word to like.
Good question.
If we talk about tolerance, we often use the word to accept, but to like is a bit more than to accept, and I would like to know what you think about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think you put your finger on something very important. To accept means that you are willing to allow something to exist even if it offends you. It carries the implication that you still have a kind of quality of judgment. But to like everything is the evacuation of the quality of judgment. It is to just say, it's all good. Everything, the good and the bad, or what society calls the good and the bad, it's all equal to me.
And actually, I'm strongly opposed against tolerance in the context of difference, because tolerance manifests differences. As a gay person, I don't want to be tolerated, but and I don't want to be accepted, because that would already manifest the difference, and that's what I like about the Warhol liking. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from Marie Fürstenberg. Yeah, bitte.
Yes, good evening. Thank you so much for this very inspiring presentation. It was very interesting. I don't know that much about Andy Warhol, I must admit, but I was wondering if he says he dislikes everything and nothing is anything in like beyond the surface. What was his take on relationships? Did he say relationships are meaningless, or what did he?
He had relationships with people. He clearly had people he loved. He had a pretty rich emotional life. I think what Warhol is conscious of is that there are, despite his push for a kind of undifferentiated liking, he of course recognized that where he lived, who he dated, what he ate. You know, the basic terms of life were inevitably going to be in consistency with his taste, in concert with his tastes. He can't escape taste completely, but what he can do is perform publicly a kind of refusal of taste. And in publicly performing a refusal of taste, he is doing a particular kind of politics. He's manifesting a different kind of identity than the kinds of identities that were then being birthed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's so hard to grasp that on the one hand side, you say that everybody is equal, and then you still find particularities about particular people.
Well, because
that's why you like those people, but maybe not as much as others. Wouldn't he have to, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
Wouldn't you have to like everyone the same?
But I mean, what can you do, right? You have to live your life. And I think there's a distinction between what Warhol's persona does and says and enacts and produces, and what Warhol, the individual, finds sustaining, finds homey, right? And what I'm interested in is what Warhol performed, what Warhol, the public figure, did, said, made.
This may be the link to the split persons like Jackie, Marilyn. Yeah.
And there's no doubt in my mind that they are linked. I mean, he only gets interested in these individuals in the very week that the public and private selves start to diverge. I mean, quite literally, the week it happens is the week he paints them.
The gilded cage. You told it, yes. Yeah, Marie Fürstenberg.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Okay. Okay, there is another question from Dirk Stoll. Moment. Das, ich versuche es vorzuhören. Frage, warum? Herr Stoll, Sie müssten vielleicht die Frage noch mal präzisieren. Ich glaube, Sie möchten fragen, können Sie die Frage für mich noch mal präzisieren? Es steht, warum hat der Künstler, die ihn groß gemacht haben, nach seiner internationalen Anerkennung nichts mehr wissen wollten? Muss, glaube ich, eine Präzisierung hin. Vielleicht noch mal kurz in den Chat tippen. Vielleicht gibt es in der Zwischenzeit noch andere Fragen. Im YouTube sehe ich eine weitere Frage von Joanna Strakowski. So, an artist can create queer art independent of their sexual orientation. Even straight artists can create queer art. Question for you, Mr. Katz.
Absolutely. In fact, my whole sort of assumption about queer art is that it is not related to one's individual sexuality. By definition, it seems, a queer art, as distinct from a gay art, right, is capable of being created by anybody who has doubt as to the binary nature of sexuality or the determining nature of sexuality, that sexuality is somehow such a significant aspect of personal difference that it engenders a different human being. I'm an historian, and one of the things that we see is in the vast bulk of human experience, same-sex desire and different sex desire coexisted, often at the same time with the same people. And what we find is that it didn't create two segregated communities. It was always one. And what I've been trying to argue is that Warhol's attempting to return to that oneness.
I think there is in
the first section of our exhibition. It's a section of very early paintings, Warhol, before Warhol, from the late 40s. There's an interesting painting in this context, which is named Two Dogs Kissing. So I think that's already there in this painting is already said what it means.
Yes.
Yeah, so there is, yeah, no, there is no other question, just yeah, very warm words for you on YouTube. And I think it was a great evening, a great lecture. You see, there are a lot of questions surround us. So I think it's a theme where we need maybe much more to speak, much more time, more lectures. And I'm so happy and thankful for having you here this evening on as a speaker for KunstBewusst. And yeah, so I have to say only thank you so much, Professor Katz.
Pleasure.
And I hope after Corona, maybe we have another possibility to welcome you here in Cologne at the Museum Ludwig and with our Society of the Friends of the Museum Ludwig.
Thank you very much. I hope so.
Thank you. Please come, you know, till the 13th of June. We give you a tour, but we always will give you a tour. Please come to the Museum Ludwig.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.